how long would it take for the share to vanish? I'm asking this because if there's a possible scenario in which wages keep increasing, right? And most of the tasks are done by robots, then we have to work very little, but we could enjoy an increasing standard of living, right? As long as the share doesn't get to zero.
That's correct. Even if the share goes to zero, we could enjoy a decent standard of living. Because, as I said, absolute wages relative to the price of consumption goods and capital might keep rising, even if the share goes to zero. But the point is, in this mystical society that I'm thinking about, there's going to be enormously high inequalities of income. So it's really a statement about relativistic distribution rather than the question of having an absolute. In fact, the whole model presumes that there's growth to start with. So it was just really trying to explore this idea of very high relative inequalities.
We have a question from Anurag, who is joining us on Zoom. And he asks, as an economy progresses, the wages for unskilled workers increase due to lack of supply. Has your fourth law taken this into consideration?
Right. So actually, if you look at the work of, okay, so let's take an example. Let's consider the automation of hamburgers, right? Of course, it can be automated. It can be very easily automated. But is it profitable to automate hamburgers? Obviously not, right? Because there's lots of cheap labor around. Yeah. If there's lots of cheap labor around, the automation is not going to happen. So the process only comes into play when wages rise sufficiently in a particular sector, right? So then you might say, well, there'll always be, in Arthur Lewis style, we'll always have impoverished labor. Well, maybe if we always have impoverished labor, then this process is not going to happen, right? But it's not just a question of know-how, it's a question of when it becomes profitable to carry out the substitution. So if you look at David Outtor's work, for example, you will see that he talks about a vanishing of the middle. So it's in the middle that wages are high enough so that it's worth automating, right? At the top end, we still have the researchers who are ruling the roost. Human labor is very important at the top, so that's protected for now. And at the bottom, they're also protected, quote unquote protected, because they're protected because the wages are still so low. Right. So if you look at the automation as a function of the economic importance of the job, then that function is typically U-shaped. Yeah. Did I get that right? U-shaped? The other way around. Inverted U-shaped. Maximal automation in the middle, minimal automation on the sides. I hope that answers your question to some extent.
The data on this really starts falling, the labor share post 1980. So we really have 30 years of thereabouts. And then there is a longer history of these income shares data, which in some sense was Kuznets was responding to all of that. So we've got, I mean, is there a thing about that maybe we are trying to construct too much? This could be a temporary phase, and we are sort of constructing laws, even though this may be.
Absolutely.
So there's that. I mean, I just wanted your, so how much weight do you put on that? And the second part is in this weight of avoiding this trap, you said one of these things was moving into newer and newer sectors. So I think my sense from the way you structured it was preferences were somewhat invariant, that we sort of, but a lot of this love for new things might well be based on things that we don't find, or things that are vanishing might be, in some sense, if things that are much more labor intensive become things that we start valuing, and that's about preferences. And
very good, very good. Okay, so the answer to your first question is, I'm not relying so much on the data. We see it happening over the last 30, 40 years, right? But I'm relying really on Ricardo's intuition about the theory of land. Okay, I'm really relying on the fact that if people are accumulating capital per capita, take this one sentence from me, if not anything else. If people are accumulating capital per capita, then capital endowment has to grow relative to the labor endowment. That there's an inbuilt tendency for things to shift against labor, as long as there is growth. If there's decline, it's the other way around. Yeah, and if it's stationary, there's none. So that's a quick answer to your first question. The second is precisely the Eswar and Kotwal quotation that I put up, which is that as we move from sector to sector, maybe we develop a taste for labor-intensive things. Then it's all cool, right? I mean, then this model, if we can always find new niches, right, which are progressively more labor-friendly, we're all okay. Ashok doesn't think so. He thinks that as we move, things get more capital intensive. But notice, this is for the students, notice how interesting these questions are from the point of view of research, right? We are asking, preferences are non-homothetic. Everybody knows that, right? But in what way are they non-homothetic? Are they non-homothetic in a way that encourages the use of capital, or are they non-homothetic in a way that encourages the use of labor? You won't get that in a standard textbook. Yeah, so that's the takeaway. So I agree with you, but I want to leave it as an open question.
So you talk a lot about theory, but I wanted to know about the empirical speculation that you have for India. So a popular thought amongst the AI community is that AI is not sort of displacing jobs, rather it is creating ones, except for the jobs that are created are not for the same labor that has been displaced in the process, right? So what happens, and this is related to the sovereign funds argument that you also put forward, what happens when the share of labor of, say, high skilled, the demand of those relative labor for high skilled is going up, but the share is not going up in India. So there's an increase in the lower skilled labors relative to that of high skilled, but the demand for high skilled is going up. In that sense, the absolute wages are not increasing as much as you'd like them to be. So what happens in that case?
Right. So actually, when you simulate a model like the first one that I wrote down, it gives rise to lots of cycles for precisely the reason you're talking about. Whenever a particular thing like this happens, the demand for labor actually goes up in one sector and comes down in another, right? And so the whole process is a highly non-monotonic process. So when Bharat asked, for example, how long will it take for this thing to happen? Is there a sort of monotonicity result? Of course, it's too much to hope that one economic theory will give you a quantitative thing. That's silly to think about. But at least can we say, okay, if this process goes at this rate for another 100 years, what can we say? And this model is not very good at that. It's not very good at that precisely for the reason that you're giving, that capital is always schizophrenic, right? It's always displacing as it is embracing. But what this model does give you is that overall, there is a tendency towards, at least the prediction is, overall, there is a tendency towards displacement. Okay, so good point.